Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into a topic that a lot of you have been asking about: agroecology. We've got a ton of research and articles you guys send in, so we're going to try to make sense of it all, see how it connects. It's all about this really fascinating way of looking at farming, how we can make it work better with nature, not against it.
Yeah, agroecology, that's a great way to put it. It's really a whole philosophy. It's not just a set of rules you follow.
Right.
It's about working with nature's rhythms and processes.
I like that. Working with nature. And, when we talk about nature and farming, you got to start with the soil, right? I mean, that's where it all begins.
Absolutely. The soil is so important. Agroecology really focuses on healthy soil and everything that goes with that.
So it's more than just dirt.
Oh, yeah, way more. Think of it like a whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's teeming with life. Billions of microorganisms, fungi, all kinds of creatures working together, and they all play a role.
And one of the things that really stood out in the research you sent is this idea of diversifying cropping systems. Instead of those big fields with just one crop, agroecology is all about mixing things up.
Exactly. I mean, it seems kind of counterintuitive at first. We're so used to seeing those massive fields of corn or soybeans.
Just stretching as far as the eye can see.
Right. But that's what we call monoculture, planting the same thing over and over again. And that's not how nature works,
So what happens?
Well, it depletes the soil, makes it vulnerable to pests and diseases. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket. Agroecology takes a different approach.
So more like a salad bowl.
Exactly. It's about mimicking the diversity we see in natural ecosystems.
So you might have a field with rows of corn and beans and squash all growing together.
Right, or a farmer might rotate crops. Plant corn one year, beans the next, maybe wheat after that.
And that helps.
Absolutely. It breaks those pest cycles. It helps prevent diseases. Different crops have different needs. They take different nutrients from the soil, so you're not constantly depleting the same nutrients.
It's like giving the soil a balanced diet.
I like that analogy.
Speaking of diet, there's this term that comes up a lot in the research: organic matter. I feel like I hear that everywhere these days, but what is it exactly?
Yeah, it's become a bit of a buzzword, but it's super important. Basically, organic matter is decomposed plant and animal material. All that stuff that breaks down and becomes part of the soil.
Like compost.
Compost is a great example. Think of it as nature's recycling system. All those kitchen scraps, yard waste, it all gets transformed into this nutrient-rich material that's like gold for your soil.
It's like a superfood smoothie for your garden.
Exactly. And there are other ways to add organic matter too, like cover crops. Some farmers plant specific crops not to harvest, but just to improve the soil.
So they're like green manure.
That's a good way to put it. It's all about working with those natural cycles. Instead of relying on synthetic fertilizers, we can use plants themselves to nourish the soil.
It's fascinating. So much of agroecology seems to be about mimicking nature's wisdom.
It really is. And it's not just about the soil. This same philosophy applies to pest management too. Instead of automatically reaching for chemical pesticides, agroecology emphasizes a more holistic approach called integrated pest management, or IPM.
Okay, so let's talk about bugs, because I think there's this misconception that agroecology means just letting pests take over your crops. But it's not about surrendering, is it?
Not at all. IPM is about being smart about pest management. It's like being a detective. You got to figure out the pest's weaknesses, understand their life cycle, and then use a combination of tactics to keep them in check.
So instead of just spraying everything with pesticides, which can have all sorts of negative side effects.
Right. With IPM, you might attract beneficial insects by planting certain flowers. You might use traps to monitor pest populations. And you only intervene when it's absolutely necessary.
So it's about finding those natural balances.
That's the key. You're trying to create an ecosystem where natural predators can help control the pests.
Like ladybugs eating aphids.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about soil health and pest management. What about water? That's got to be a big concern for any farmer.
Absolutely. Water is a precious resource, and agroecology is all about using it wisely.
So what are some of the strategies?
Well, one simple but effective technique is rainwater harvesting. Instead of letting rainwater just run off its side, you collect it from rooftops or other surfaces.
Like having your own mini reservoir.
Exactly. And then there's drip irrigation. Instead of spraying water all over the field, drip irrigation delivers water directly to the plant roots.
So you're not wasting any.
Right. You're using water much more efficiently. And that's good for the environment and good for the farmer's bottom line.
This is all really impressive. It seems like agroecology has a solution for just about every challenge.
It's about working with nature, not against it. And there's still so much more to explore, like agroforestry and livestock integration.
Okay, so those sound fascinating. Farms that are more like forests. We're definitely going to have to dive into that next.
So picture this. You walk onto a farm, and it's not just these wide open fields,
Okay.
It's like this tapestry of trees and crops and animals all mixed together. That's what we're talking about with agroforestry and livestock integration.
So instead of separating everything out like we see in a lot of industrial farms.
Yeah, it's more about bringing things together, creating these systems that are more like what you'd see in nature, more integrated.
It's almost like a forest garden. I've heard people talking about those.
That's a good analogy. With agroforestry, you're intentionally adding trees and shrubs into the farm.
So you might have fruit trees scattered throughout a pasture.
Right, or rows of trees planted alongside crops. It's about creating these multiple layers of vegetation.
I like that, layers, because it's not just about what's growing on the ground.
Exactly. And those trees, they do so much more than just look pretty. Well, they provide shade for the livestock. That's super important in hot climates. Keeps the animals cooler.
Makes sense.
And they help improve the soil, too. Their leaves fall and decompose, adding organic matter. And some trees can even fix nitrogen from the air.
Oh, wow. So they're like natural fertilizers.
Exactly. And of course, you can get food from the trees themselves. Fruit nuts, timber.
It's like a bonus harvest.
Right. So you've got these multiple benefits: increased productivity, better soil health, more resilience. And then you add in the livestock.
And they play a role too.
Oh, absolutely. When you integrate livestock thoughtfully, they become a really important part of the system. There's this practice called silvopasture, which is a great example.
Silvopasture. Okay, haven't heard of that one.
So it's basically combining trees, forage plants, and grazing animals all in the same area.
Okay, so like a pasture with trees scattered throughout.
Exactly. And the animals graze on the grasses and legumes that grow under the trees. They get shade and shelter. And their manure fertilizes the soil.
It's amazing how it all works together.
It really is. And the benefits, they go beyond the farm itself. Agroforestry can help sequester carbon from the atmosphere.
So it's good for climate change.
Yep. And it helps improve water quality. The trees reduce runoff and erosion. Plus, it creates habitat for all sorts of wildlife. So it's great for biodiversity, too.
It's incredible to think that something as simple as planting a tree can have such a big impact.
It's about understanding those connections, how everything is interconnected. And speaking of connections, we can't forget about technology.
Technology. So now we're talking about robots and drones on the farm.
Well, not necessarily robots, but technology can definitely play a role in agroecology.
Really? I guess when I think of technology in agriculture, I think of those giant tractors and GPS-guided combines. Not exactly the image of a small organic farm.
I get it. But technology doesn't have to be big and complicated. It can also be about using data and information to make better decisions, to refine those age-old practices that we've been talking about.
So it's not about replacing traditional knowledge, it's about enhancing it. Okay, so technology and agroecology. Help me understand this, because I think a lot of people, when they hear technology and farming, they think big industrial agriculture.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's easy to picture those massive tractors with all the bells and whistles, but technology can be a lot more than that, especially in agroecology.
So it's not about replacing farmers with robots?
No, not at all. It's more about giving farmers better tools and information to make smarter decisions, to really fine-tune those traditional practices we've been talking about.
So how does that work in practice?
Well, one example is something called precision agriculture. It's about using technology to gather data about very specific areas within a field.
So instead of just looking at the field as a whole.
Right, you're breaking it down into smaller chunks, and you're gathering all sorts of information about those areas.
Like what kind of information?
Well, it could be things like soil, moisture levels, nutrient content, plant health.
And how do you gather that data?
There are all sorts of tools you can use. Sensors that you place in the ground, drones that fly overhead and take images, GPS mapping to track everything.
So it's like giving the farmer a microscopic view of their land.
Exactly. And with all that information, they can make much more precise decisions about how to manage their crops.
So instead of just applying fertilizer or water evenly across the whole field.
Right. You can target specific areas that need it. So you're using resources much more efficiently, and you're minimizing any negative impacts on the environment.
That makes a lot of sense. Less waste, better yields. It's a win-win.
And technology can also help with things like pest and disease detection. You can use drones with special cameras to spot problems early on.
Before they spread.
Exactly. So you can intervene quickly and prevent major outbreaks.
That's really cool. It's like having an early warning system for your crops.
Right. And let's not forget about renewable energy. Solar panels, wind turbines, those can play a big role in powering farm operations and reducing reliance on fossil fuels.
So it's about creating a more sustainable system from top to bottom.
Absolutely.
Wow, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. I think we've covered so much ground today, from soil health to pest management to the role of technology. It's clear that agroecology is more than just a way of farming. It's a whole philosophy.
It really is. It's about working with nature, respecting those natural cycles, and finding ways to create a food system that's good for people and good for the planet.
And it's not just about the farmers, right? It's about all of us. As consumers, we have a lot of power to support these practices by choosing to buy food from local farmers who are using these methods, by advocating for policies that support agroecology, and by learning more about where our food comes from.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into agroecology. It's been a fascinating journey. We hope you've learned something new and are feeling inspired to get involved in this movement towards a more sustainable and delicious future.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.